Good morning. On behalf of the Indiana Balance of States Continuum of Care Board of Directors and IHCDA, I want to welcome you to the 2022 Fall Development Day Conference. It is such a pleasure to see so many new and familiar faces here today, and I want to thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to be here. That means that you are truly making a commitment to serve Hoosiers who are experiencing homelessness and to continuously improve. You may be wondering about today's event theme, moving from what now to what next. Everyone in this room knows that ever since about March of 2020, we've all been required to pivot and try one new thing after another, after another, after another. And in response to COVID-19, we've probably had to ask ourselves more than once, what now? And when we asked that question, we probably did not expect to hear anything good as the answer. Am I right? We were constantly saying, what now to HUD? What now to a supervisor? Maybe even what now to IHCDA? Because we were constantly being told there's a new program, there's a new funding source, there's a new application, there's a new opportunity. So when we asked the question, what now? We usually felt a sense of dread, exacerbation, anxiety, and perhaps even anger or desperation. In short, when we said, what now? We felt powerless and probably also very overwhelmed. But now we're here and we look back and we realize we've learned a lot of valuable lessons from the pandemic. And hopefully we have also forged just as many new partnerships. We're also no longer scrambling for toilet paper and masks and Clorox wipes. So now it's finally time to be optimistic. It's time to stop asking, what now? And it's time to start asking, what's next? And when we ask, what's next? We need to do so with the knowledge that we are part of an effort to make real forward progress in our shared mission of ending homelessness in Indiana. And we're not alone. We're part of a committed network, all striving to do our best work. And that's what today is really all about. It's about being with those folks in our network and asking, what's next? And working together to create the future we want to see for Hoosiers who are counting on all of us. That's why we're here today, to start building the what's next. Before I introduce our plenary speaker, please join me in thanking our gold sponsor, Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield. And please also help me thank our silver sponsor, Real America. And our other silver sponsor, Barnes and Thornburg LLP. I want to remind you that there is an event code that you can scan with your phone. And if you're anything like my mom, you would also like a paper copy, we can make that happen. And there are a few snafus on the QR code. So I apologize for that. And I want to make it clear that the breakout session that's occurring from 11 to 11:50 has 4 options. One of them is in this room, the auditorium. It's the Nothing for Us Without Us, which is a panel on the importance of including people with lived experience in decision-making bodies. Another option for the 11 o'clock breakout session is Diversion Could Be the Answer, a panel on using diversion effectively to address a housing crisis, and that's in conference room 22. There is a third session. It's in conference room 4-5, and it is Solutions for the Hardest to House, a panel on housing individuals with a criminal record. And then the last option that's also at 11 is Trauma-Informed Care, Serving Survivors in Shelter, and that is in conference room 17. So today, during each breakout room slot, there are 4 and sometimes 5 options. So we apologize for the snafu on the QR code. And again, if you would like a paper copy, we can get you a paper copy today. Finally, I also want to let you know that if you leave the building to get some fresh air or what have you, be very careful because you may be locked out and have to go back through security. So if you think you're just going to take a quick step outside, you may want to factor in going back through security. Just a quick heads up. But you didn't come all this way to hear me talk. It's my great pleasure to introduce our opening plenary speaker. Mr. Donald Whitehead is the Executive Director of the National Coalition for the Homeless and the co-founder of Race Equity Partners. Mr. Whitehead was the Executive Director of the Greater Cincinnati Coalition for the Homeless, Assistant Director at St. Vincent de Paul of Baltimore, Program Director at Ohio Valley Goodwill, Grant Manager at Goodwill of Greater Washington, and Director of Communications at Greenpeace, Ohio. He's also served 2 terms on the State Coalition on Housing and Homelessness in Ohio, the Baltimore 10-Year Planning Committee to End Homelessness, and the Cincinnati Continuum of Care Board, among others. Mr. Whitehead was one of only 100 advocates nationally to be invited to the first National Symposium on Homeless Research and testified before the 107th and 108th Congress. He was one of the directors of the creation and introduction of the Bringing Home America Act and has served on advisory committees for Presidents Bush, Clinton, Bush II, and Obama. He received a Distinguished Service Award for his work on homelessness from the Congressional Black Caucus and received a second recognition from Congress in 2008. Mr. Whitehead is a veteran from Cincinnati, Ohio, and he experienced homelessness himself. We're so honored to have him with us this morning. Let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Donald Whitehead, Jr.
Good morning. How are you all today? It's really an honor to be here today. I have a lot of fondness in my heart for the state of Indiana and Indianapolis and some of your congressional representatives. We wrote a bill called the Bring America Home Act that would have ended homelessness, and that was actually sponsored by Julia Carson. If that had passed in 2003, you wouldn't probably be sitting here today. You'd be doing something that's a lot more fun and relaxing. We unfortunately didn't get that passed. The last time I was here, though, wasn't as pleasant. I did a keynote for the Indiana State Coalition on 9/11. So glad that we are not in that kind of space in the world today. Just a little bit about the National Coalition for the Homeless. We're the oldest organization that works on homeless issues in the country, who works directly with people experiencing homelessness. If you know, you may know of some of our work. If you work in a shelter or in a transitional housing program, you've heard of the McKinney-Vento Act. We actually drafted the McKinney-Vento Act. If you're a school liaison and you work with children who are experiencing homelessness, we help to pass the Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act as well. And there are several others grants that benefit people experiencing homelessness. So we have a long track record of actually addressing the issue of homelessness and providing resources, but we still have a long way to go. I'm also, I wear 2 hats. I'm also the founder of an organization called Racial Equity Partners. And Racial Equity Partners I founded with Jeff Olivet Many of you may know that name. Jeff Olivet is now the executive director of the Interagency Council on Homelessness. And so we founded the group because Jeff and others at C4 initiatives, they started doing research around the country, and what they found was a really serious level of inequity. They found that people who are experiencing homelessness, there was an inequitable number of people of color who were experiencing homelessness, and also they were less likely to be able to get permanent housing resources. And that could have been a result of a number of factors, but in further research, we looked at the level of poverty across all segments of the population. And if you look at people experiencing homelessness of color, the number of people in poverty is at a lower level than the number of people in homelessness. If you look at other population segments, it goes down. So there's less people in homelessness than there are in poverty. So we look for all the reasons. What we arrived at is we have an issue in this country that has been with us for a long time, and that issue is structural racism. And I'm going to talk about some things that may feel a bit uncomfortable to people, but I want to paint a picture of how we got here, how these disparities happened, and also give you some tools that might help you in your community be able to address those and make sure that everybody is receiving services at an equal level, that people with lived experience, and I can't stress this anymore, people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So in everything that you do that involves homelessness, it is so important that you not only have people with lived experience at the table, but you equip them so that they have an equal space at the table. It's not just about having bodies at a table, it's about making sure that there's power sharing, that they have the ability to be a part of the real decisions and not just are there checking off a box. So I'm going to drive through history really fast. Because I start very early in history when homelessness first started in this country. So the modern theory, what you'll hear a lot is that there's been 4 episodes of homelessness in this country. And when people talk about homelessness, they usually start with they start in the period right after the Civil War. And then they move forward, but it actually started a lot sooner than that. So I'm going to take you back a little further to trace the actual beginnings of homelessness in the United States of America. So I want to start with why there is so much conversation in the country and there is so much conversation in our communities about race. We have experienced these times in our history, points where there are inflection points that make us start to take a deep look at how we communicate, how we live in this country, and how conditions force us into decisions. So these are some seminal moments that happened in our country to drive us to these conversations on a regular basis. So the first picture at the top is Ahmaud Arbery. He was actually chased down and killed by vigilantes simply because of the color of his skin. And I'll also say that I know everybody in here has faced a hardship. I'm not unaware that everybody struggles. It doesn't matter what skin you're in, you're going to have trouble. The difference in this issue is that most of those troubles don't happen because of the color of your skin. They may happen because of your education or bad decisions or just bad luck sometimes, but most of those challenges and hardships don't happen because of the color of your skin. Ahmaud Arbery was killed because of the color of his skin. Breonna Taylor, if you remember her, she's not far from here in Louisville. She died as a result of a no-knock police raid, and no one's been held accountable for that. The picture at the bottom on your far right is of COVID. And the reason that picture is there is because of some of the things you'll hear. COVID had a disproportionate effect on people of color. So more people of color died, more people of color got sick. And you'll see in our history how we have made intentional decisions that made that happen. So African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and more than all Native Americans in our country were disproportionately affected. The picture in our middle is a picture of how we're dealing with immigration now. You see kids in cages. You've heard that a lot. Most of the people in this room are a result of people immigrating to this country. However, the people that are brown are treated very differently than other immigrants in this country. And finally, the woman on the left is a woman who, because she was walking her dog without a leash, she was challenged by an African-American male. She called the police. And what's important about this is that that could have ended very differently. He simply asked her to put her dog on a chain, but she thought she called the police and said he was threatening to kill her. And that could have ended very differently. So those are the things that have driven us to a real discussion for the first time in a really long time about race relations and structural racism in this country. And so I want to just make sure we have a grounding in structural racism. When I talk about structural racism, this is what I mean. So this is a system. It may be a government, it may be a system of care in a community that intentionally makes decisions that have an impact that is different for people based on the color of their skin. So people that are white are usually advantaged because of these decisions, and people of color face a disadvantage because of these issues. This is not about an individual, this is about a structure. And these decisions, again, are not mistakes or happenstance. These are deliberate decisions that cause trauma to people of color. Institutional is the institutions that carry that on. They actually perpetrate that particular issue by continuing to practice it. And then there's interpersonal. So interpersonal racism is the racism that we hear about that most of us have a distaste for. So that's the Proud Boys and other groups who practice intentional racism. It's Kanye West who practices anti-Semitism. It's people who do that directly. But there's also another form of interpersonal racism. That's those of us who practice it without knowing we're practicing it. And we'll get to that a little later. But again, most of what I'll talk about today is at the structural level. There is some institutional, but it's not saying anybody in this room is a racist. It's saying that we have had intentional decisions that affected the structures of different parts of our society. And these were intentional decisions, and they caused a disparate impact on people of color. The one that really drove this is the newest inflection point, and that's George Floyd. And George Floyd is very important because for the first time in history, we saw what was equivalent to a lynching on national TV. We saw a person actually lose their life in front of our eyes. We haven't seen that much. Other inflection points are Emmett Till. We saw his coffin. We saw the destruction of his body. His mother made a really courageous choice to do that. And it brought the issue to the forefront. It brought it into our living rooms. We heard about it. We thought it existed. We didn't know. But after George Floyd, it was in our living rooms. And George Floyd also represents the three levels of racism, just to give you some grounding in what I mean by that. So George Floyd was killed by a police officer from the Minneapolis Police Department. The Minneapolis Police Department has found to be racial inequities when it comes to addressing people of color for decades. And that continued in that police department for decades. Intentional decisions. That's structural racism. The institutional racism came because the police department that the officer worked at, although he had 18 complaints about his treatment of people of color, he was actually a trainer in that police department. So that's perpetuating institutional racism. And the individual racism, of course, is the act that cost George Floyd his life. So those are the three levels of racism exemplified by the issue of George Floyd's death. And so the reason we talk about this today, the reason we have to talk about this is that George Santayana says those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We want to live in a world free of that kind of structural and institutional racism, but we can't forget the racism that's already happened in our country. So just as a picture, the first really egregious form of racism happened when this country was founded. And the reason I say that, these are this is the land we sit on today in this country. And that land, as you see, was occupied. So in every piece of this land, there was somebody already living here when this country was discovered. And that is when you saw the first incidents of homelessness and structural racism. So what happened to Native Americans in this country, an intentional decision. Their lands were taken through violence, through combat. There was all kinds of egregious acts against some of the people. A lot of the stories that you hear about Thanksgiving are that people were welcomed with open arms. That's not exactly a true depiction of history. People were attacked, beaten, robbed, raped, and their land was stolen, and they were made homeless. So this is the first incidence of homeless in our country. So as I said, homelessness goes back a long way. It didn't just start in modern times. It started a long time ago. People lived in those communities and they were pushed out of their homes. They lost their possessions. They were made homeless. The next really important piece of history and one of the most egregious acts in our country was in 1619. This is the first slave ship that landed in Virginia. So people were brought from their homes in Africa to a place that they had no orientation to, and they were made homeless again. So the beginning of enslavement happened. This was one of the most egregious times in our history. We started with this, and it became the economic engine of this country. A lot of this country was built on the backs of these enslaved individuals, and more people were taken because we found out how valuable they were to the development of this country. And then the first actual act in this country that was forced displacement was this particular event. One of the places where the use of enslaved people was most beneficial was in the South. And so what was found in the South were these fertile lands that agriculture could really be built on. Unfortunately, that part of the country was inhabited by the Choctaw and the Seminoles and the Chickasaw and other tribes. And what happened, the Cherokee, what happened at that particular time is there was an act that was created. It was called the Indian Removal Act. And all of those tribes were moved to the Southwest, to the Plains region. Thousands died on the way. They died from disease, they died from violence. Thousands of people died on the way. This was called the Trail of Tears. You may have heard that in our history. What's important about this is there was an actual law passed in the country, the Indian Removal Act, that actually made homelessness a reality and ingrained it in our history. And so the Indian Removal Act caused many people to die and many people to become homeless. I'm going to fast forward a little bit. So I'm jumping through history. This is a map of the in the 1930s and 40s. So because of after the Civil War, there was the Reconstruction period in our country. And that's when our country had the opportunity to get it right. We could equal the playing field. So people of color, formerly enslaved people were freed by the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. But one piece of that still remained. People could still be jailed if they were found guilty of crimes. And so A couple other things emerged from that. It was a failure. So people were supposed to get 40 acres and a mule. Have you heard that before? But a lot of people were not okay with the 40 acres and a mule. After Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson actually gave most of what had been gained through Reconstruction back. And finally, Rutherford B. Hayes actually removed troops from the South. And that created a period in our history that was one of the most egregious periods that we know about. You had Jim Crow laws. You had the implementation of sharecropping. People were forced into debt on sometimes the same plantations that they worked on. There was violence. Over 3,000 people were lynched during this time. And the thing you should know about lynching is that it wasn't just an act by the governments or sheriffs. These became family events where people came to witness the lynching. So a horrible time in our history. And what happened after that was that people migrated to the north. Over 6 million African Americans left the South. One, because of the treatment, which was absolutely egregious, but also they left because there was the idea of better jobs in the North. So they could earn about $75 a day in the South, sharecropping or doing agricultural labor. They could make about $5 an hour in some of the northern cities like Chicago and New York and other cities. So 6 million people moved. They thought they would be greeted with open arms because, of course, the North had fought for their freedom in the Civil War. But what happened is they weren't treated with open arms. Between 1910 and 1930, we had what's called restricted covenants in this country. And that meant that you could not sell your property to an African American or an immigrant. And if they were able to access it, they were not able to insure it. And many, many people over the years have lost their homes. But what is important about this is that home ownership and property is the engine for economic security in this country. To be able to survive and gain wealth in this country, you need to own property. Most immigrants and African Americans were prevented from owning property. Now, those covenants did get outlawed in the 1940s. In the 1930s, though, after the Great Depression, and there were 1 million homeless people in the Great Depression, pretty startling number. But what usually happened in the United States when we saw kind of a really huge downturn is that we also found that the federal government would create programs to address it. But unfortunately, that stopped. And I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but this is a really important issue. It's redlining. Everybody has probably heard the term redlining. If you haven't, there's a couple of really good books that you should read on it. So redlining was the fact that the federal government, again, made a decision that they would not insure homes in those red line communities. And what was in those red line communities were people of color and immigrants. So they were forced into these communities. And they couldn't buy property in the green or blue or yellow communities. There might have been a few in the yellow, but the green and blue were specifically reserved for white people. And even if you wanted to buy as a white person in a red community, you would not be able to do that. You would be discouraged from doing that. So the Federal Home Loan Bank, the bankers, structural institutional racism were a part of that. These were intentional decisions to separate people. Those communities were deemed dangerous. They were labeled as dangerous communities because they had too many people of color in them. And so the lack of generating wealth, the other issue that happened here was the GI Bill and the education benefits from the GI Bill. So you can gain a foothold in America if you have property. You also can gain a foothold if you have an education. So educational benefits were created in the GI Bill, but most of those benefits were not open to immigrants or people of color, although they fought in the Civil War. So also at this time in the 1930s, you had the first public housing. And public housing was segregated by race in most communities. Even in the yellow communities that were already integrated, if there was public housing created, it was segregated by color in all of those communities. So again, the federal government is at work here creating decisions that have long-term impacts. And certainly redlining had a tremendous long-term impact. And what is that impact? Today, what it looks like is that African Americans are disproportionately homeless at a rate of 3 to 1 compared to the general population. So what that means is that African Americans make up about 13% of the federal population, but they make up over 40% of the homeless population. If you look at Native Americans, it's an 8 to 1 ratio. So 8 times as many people that are represented in the general population, that percentage in the homeless population is 8 to 1. And what's not on here is the Pacific Islanders. That's actually at 9 to 1. So people of color are disproportionately involved in the homeless population. It does not matter where you are in the United States. So whether you're in a population that has a very small population of people of color, some of our plain states have very low numbers when it comes to people of color, but the ratio is still the same. So that drove us to understanding a belief that this was actually a bigger problem than just economics, that there was something else underlying these issues. And so that's why we started our work with Racial Equity Partners. That's why the country has really started to really address this issue in a fundamental way. I wanted to give you a few definitions. And when I talked about the individual racism, there's some definitions here I want to share with you. Implicit and explicit bias. So explicit bias is something that's directly expressed by people. So you're saying, I'm not going to hire that person at my organization because they don't look like me. So that would be explicit bias. So you are aware of the bias and you actually operate in the bias consciously. There's no automatic reaction to make you do this. You do it right away. So an example would be a sign in a window of an apartment that says, we don't rent to, and whoever that to may be. It could be women with children. It could be people of color. It could be people that come from other religious or ethnic backgrounds. If you had a sign like that, that would be an example of explicit bias. Implicit bias is expressed indifferently. You're unaware of the bias. It operates subconsciously. And that example of that would be a property manager doing more criminal background checks on African Americans than whites. And we know that happens. If you do housing, you know that sometimes some of our landlords have practices that have a disparate impact on people of color. And sometimes that's unconscious. Sometimes what we found is when we look at the workforce in homeless programs, what we found is that at the entry level, there's a lot of diversity, but the higher up you get in the organization, that diversity dissipates. And, we have to believe that there's bias involved in that. Sometimes it's explicit bias and sometimes it's implicit bias. How many times have you been in an interview and somebody mentions their college or they mention where they grew up and that person becomes a more favorable candidate to you? That's bias. When we make our decisions based on something other than the person's qualification, it becomes bias. So here's a lot of different things that, again, a little deeper dive into bias. There's different kinds. There's gender bias. There's affinity bias. There's stereotype bias. There's gender bias. We know that happens a lot too. Overwhelmingly, the leadership in the homeless movement is white women. So there's some gender bias in a lot of different places, but if we look at boards of directors, there's a gender bias in the other direction. So most of the people on boards of directors are white men. And there's also personal discomfort with people just having different ideas of what society should look like and what norms are in society. So the benefits of tackling unconscious bias are it leads to fair decision-making. It attracts diverse talent. It increases creativity and innovation. It improves employee engagement. It results in higher levels of productivity, and it increases company revenue. All of this is based on fact. I'm not just saying that. There's research that says if you start to integrate and start to address bias in your processes, it actually helps the overall bottom line of the company, and it helps it in all these other ways. So seven unexpected biases in hiring. Name bias. There's research that says if someone presents to you with a name that sounds African or African-American or Latinx, that you're less likely to hire that person percentage-wise. If you have a neutral name or a white-sounding name, you're more likely to get hired. These are facts. I'm not making any of this up. There's also job description bias. Often we overemphasize things like education in our job description. So while it's important, and some funders will force you to have a level of education for particular jobs, we have to look more deeply at lived experience versus learned experience. Sometimes lived experience is just as valuable as learned experience. We know that if someone has been in a process for 30 years, they probably have as much of a handle on how to do that job as anybody in our room, regardless of their education status. There's predecessor bias, there's bias interview questions, just like me bias, and intuition bias. So you might encounter somebody and you might have that feeling that maybe I shouldn't hire this person, even though they're very highly qualified. Bias comes into play all the time. And, I just want to leave you with the understanding that everybody in this room has bias. Bias is not race generated, it's race neutral. All of us are going to have bias, especially when bias happens most often is when we're in positions of power. When we can make decisions about hiring or finances or those kinds of things, that's when bias really comes into play. So I'm going to give you a couple of definitions. Diversity. It's a celebration of all the ways in which people are different from one another, seeing differences as important and valuable traits in groups, institutions, and in communities. It includes the variety of shared and different characteristics, including ethnicity, race, gender, age, disability, education, sexual orientation, and much more. Also includes celebrating differences in opinions, perspectives, and values. One of the things that's important about having a diverse workforce is that it eliminates blind spots. And so often, because we haven't been a part of that experience, we have these blind spots. And when we're developing programs, if we develop them and not looking at blind spots, it does many times end up in situations where bias comes into play. One really good example of that is the VI SPID Act. Good intentions. We wanted to separate people out. We wanted to make sure people were being able to get into the homeless service system and get into housing in the quickest way. And we wanted to make sure the hardest to serve were the people who got that information. Well, studies have found that there's bias in that particular tool. Most people are moving away from it, but it actually has racial bias because there were blind spots and there were no people of color or people with lived experience developing that tool. They would have come up with other. So one of the biggest issues, the diseases that are mentioned, none of the common diseases of people of color are part of that tool. So when you're looking at people being vulnerable, those issues don't come up because there was a blind spot there. So here's some people don't like this. I think it's just fine, but this is the equity versus equality. A version of equity versus equality. This highlights the importance of the inclusion of people with disabilities. So basically, it's not just giving everybody the same access to something. It's actually giving people the tools they need so that access is equal. So you see the woman on the end in the wheelchair, she's able to watch the game, but the tool that we gave her to watch the game is not equitable. It's equity is giving people the tools they need to succeed at the same time and giving them tools for the same thing at the same time. So equality is letting them see the game. Equity is making sure that they actually can see the game. So equality is when everyone is given the same resources or opportunities, Equity is providing targeted resources and opportunities for each person's unique circumstances and needs so that everyone may have the same chance at success. And so one thing that's really important to remember, and there's a great book on this called The Sum of Us. When we talk about equity and equality, what's important to remember is that if we can create a tool that's able to provide equity and equality for people of color, we can create a tool that has equity for everybody. So when it's called targeted universalism. If we can make a tool that gets to the strategy to help the person who is the most marginalized, so that would be an African-American woman who's disabled and is homeless. If we can find a solution for her, we find a solution for everybody. So a rising tide lifts all boats. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make sure that everybody benefits equally and everybody has a chance to move through the system in a better way. So inclusion is authentically bringing traditionally excluded individuals or groups into processes, activities, and decision makings in a way that shares power. And I want to go back to shared power. It's not just bringing people to the table, it's making sure that we think about how they can be included. And it may be our board of directors where we want to make sure that we have people included, people experiencing homelessness, people of color, other marginalized groups. But we have to make sure the meetings at a time that everybody can make it, that there's provisions for daycare, that we may not use the same decision-making process. Not everybody is a fan of Robert's Rules of Order. So sometimes we have to think about other consensus building models, because at the end of the day, we want to share power, because you saw in a couple of slides before the benefit of that. We all benefit if we create the kind of diversity that we're talking about. So I'm going to go through I'm going to try to go through this really quickly. This is the framework for transmission. For how do we get started? How do we do this? It's not an overnight job. It requires a lot of really thoughtful, intentional work to get to the point where we have equity and diversity in our communities. So we have to establish a shared vocabulary. So that process I went through of all of these definitions we know, but what we try to do is make sure that people think a little harder about them. We have to identify somebody who's going to carry this work, because it doesn't just happen generically. You have to have a group, a couple of people at your organization who are going to continue to make sure we remember these issues. George Santayana said, if we don't remember our past, we'll recreate it. So even in our organizations, we have to make sure that there's a champion, that there's a group of people who carry this work. Identify race equity champions at the board and senior leadership. So not only the board, but also the senior leadership of your organization. Name race equity work as a strategic imperative of your organization. Define and communicate how race equity connects to your mission, vision, and organizational work. Open a continuous dialogue about race equity work. There's a ton of research. There's a ton of videos. There's a lot of articles. Disaggregate data, collect, disaggregate, and review. And what we mean by that is a lot of the data that we get about our programs is not disaggregated by race. So it doesn't give us the picture of how we're doing. I guarantee you, if you look at it, you're going to find some places where there have been issues where people have not been treated equally. So do the work of disaggregating your data, and that'll move you a long way towards this. So here's just a couple of things I talked about before, the statistics. Jamal needed 8 additional years of experience to be considered as qualified as Greg. That's the name bias. A queer woman received 30% fewer callbacks than her heterosexual peers, listing her position in an LGBTQ organization. So in your resume, if you put in affinity groups, you may have some problems, and bias comes into play. Listing membership in a PTA, this is really a deep one to me. Listing membership in a PTA made a mother 79% less likely to be hired than a non-mother and offered $11,000 less in starting salary. just because they put down that they were in a PTA. So that's another problem that we have to deal with. That's gender bias. And actually bias around people having a family, which is that research really kind of startled me. So inclusive recruitment and hiring. So a visible commitment to DEI, making sure that you're doing things within your organization to be able to really advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, build relationship with a more diverse set of people and organizations. What some organizations have done is reached out to job fairs, gone to historically Black colleges and other institutions. Training and understanding bias and privilege. These kinds of trainings are important. It allows us to get into what we call courageous conversations. We don't often talk about the issue of race in this country. We're afraid if we're white, we're afraid that we're going to say the wrong thing. Sometimes if we're Black, we're afraid that we're going to be charged with being the champion for the Black community. None of those things have to exist. So you have to bring this into your workplace so you can have real, genuine, and courageous discussions about it. So job descriptions and rubrics needs to have versus have to have skills. That's what I was talking about. You may not need a PhD to be an outreach worker. Now, outreach is important. Don't let me underscore that. But you don't need a PhD to be an outreach worker. You don't need a PhD most times to be a case manager. But many times in our job descriptions, that's what we're asking for. The language that we use in our job descriptions, we changed the language in ours to say that we were very comfortable with people of color and people with lived experience. And the number of people with lived experience just rose by dramatic numbers. I don't know what the exact number is. And again, lived experience versus learned experience. We need to take into account the kind of work that people have done, even if they haven't had the time to be able to get that degree. So Bias Interrupters is a website that you can use. There's also the Equity Center, and then there's Awake to Woke to Work is another book. There's so much research out here that people can use in conversations. So here's a quote that I wanted to share with you. The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And that's the only way forward. So we're not asking you to make a commitment or pretend that you're free of it. We all have some level, but it's the commitment to fight to change it. And that's all we're asking for. And that is a really powerful quote. So organizational change at the organizational agency level, leaders and line staff can champion racial equity. Once policies are created to address organizational changes, procedures need to be implemented to support the new policies. So it's not enough to write it down in a policy manual. You have to create the procedures that'll make it happen. Form of policy standpoint solutions must be systemic, ambitious, and sustained. Such solutions require focused advocacy to shape political will and public support. A roadmap to long-term racial equity, access your data so you know where problems exist. Is there a deliberate plan to develop leadership of people of color, staff members, and to share decision-making authority? Is there power sharing at your organization? You have to ask yourself all these questions. Promote an equity in all policies, approach from all future policies and programs to commit, reviewing existing policies and programs through a racial equity lens. That means to look at it with people of color and have them react to how your policies are shaped. Advocate at the local, state, and federal levels for policies that directly address systemic racism. For institutional change, what kind of education about racism and oppression is provided through the organization? What is the culture of your organization? How does your organization work in alliance with people of color organizations? Are you reaching out to those groups that support people in the community? So where to start? Programmatic components that have policies that create inequity. So if you look at your system, a lot of people go right to the VI SPDAT that I mentioned to address racial equity, but that's not enough. You have to really go to every sector of your system and identify and ask yourself some questions that may help you understand if you need to do something different to address racial equity. So it's outreach, it's emergency shelter, it's coordinated entry, and it's housing placement. So in outreach, have people of color been consulted on where outreach should take place? So sometimes we don't get people into the system because we don't go to the places where they live. So it's important to have people that know all of those places in your system. Are there the staff that perform outreach racially, experientially, and culturally reflective of the people they're seeing? Are they trained in cultural humility and cultural responsiveness? Does the organization prioritize those statistics? Does the shelter have policy systems or environmental factors that result in BIPOC being disproportionately turned away? And I would also put disproportionately discharged from the shelter. When we look at data, we find a lot of times that there's an overrepresentation of people being banned from the shelter that are people of color. And sometimes it's the same staff member. Once in the shelter, do policy systems or environmental factors result in BIPOC disproportionately going to negative exits or being involuntary exit? Coordinated entry, can people get to your coordinated entry system? Do you provide transportation in marginalized communities for people to get there? Are extra efforts being made to contact BIPOC until housing is secured? Are you working with that person even when they get a permanent supportive housing voucher? Are you making sure that they get into housing? And the other thing that's not up here that I would say, are we putting people in healthy communities? Or are we sending people back to those same red line communities from the 30s that are unhealthy and they don't have the resources to succeed? And you see them coming back time and time again because you put them back to the source of the problem. Rapid rehousing. One thing that we're finding in a lot of communities is that people of color are being referred to rapid rehousing and white people are being referred to permanent supportive housing. It's disproportionate in most communities. Look at your data. You'll find that, and a lot of that has to do with the prioritization system. So people aren't getting the higher scores, again, because it's not equitable when it comes to the things we're asking people to consider them marginalized. I'm gonna go pretty fast. Same thing with permanent supportive housing. Is the organization really screening people, looking at landlord engagement? Those kind of things really have an impact on where people are going and who gets turned away. And our staff trained in historical and structural barriers and getting into and maintaining housing. This is where we find the biggest problem. People are sitting in a shelter, losing their voucher. You can't discriminate openly because of the Fair Housing Act, but you can discriminate by source of income or source of subsidy. So people discriminate against the Section 8 program, the VASH program, doesn't matter where the subsidy comes from. People won't take it because there is dog whistle politics involved in that. So people sometimes will not rent to people just because of the subsidy, because more people with that subsidy are people of color. These are realities. So again, these are all the areas you need to examine. And I won't re-enter those again. And when you're setting goals, we have changed the goals a little bit. We like to think of our goals as not just SMART goals, but SMARTY goals. So when you're looking at your goal, it's not only the SMART, the strategic, the measurable, the ambitious, the realistic, the time bound. We also think you should also be looking at inclusive and equitable when you're creating goals around becoming an anti-racist organization and becoming an inclusive and equitable organization. So there's also racial equity impact statements. So these are really a little more complicated than I have time to look at, but these are impact statements in your community where you can gauge your community at the government level to really look at how race is affecting your programs, policies, and procedures. And there's a lot of information on that. I would suggest that you look at the things that you might be able to find around racial equity. So here's the 8 dimensions of implementation in homeless systems. Upstream prevention, cross-sector collaboration. So upstream prevention would be looking at the feeder systems and how they are being monitored for equity and inclusion. So many of the people leaving the criminal justice system are entering into the homeless population. There's an overrepresentation of people of color in the criminal justice system and people leaving the criminal justice system. And also we have an increase of quality of life crimes. It's illegal to sit, stand, or walk. Those are disproportionately impacting people of color as well. It's gotten so bad in Tennessee, it's a felony to be homeless. So up to 6 years in prison if you're camping on public space. Anybody like permanent supportive housing? Well, it's illegal to do it in Missouri right now. Hopefully that law doesn't pass. So they have a law that says you can't use state dollars to create permanent supportive housing. So, and in Miami, there's a law that says there's a move to take all the homeless people in that community and put them in an island. That was before the hurricane, though. But the island has a hazardous waste burning facility as well. Cross-sector collaboration is really important. We have to get our medical systems, our criminal justice systems, our mental health systems, and our substance abuse systems involved in work to make sure that we have equitable and inclusive communities. Look at your data, focus on these specific at-risk groups after you look at your data. Become an anti-racist organization. We'll give you the ideas if you reach out to me to be able to do that. And again, it's not just bringing people in, it's sharing power and looking at long-term solutions. This isn't a place where myopic solutions will do. We have to look at long-term solutions so we become an equitable community across this country. So that is my information. So I put both of my hats here. So if your organization might want someone to come to talk about this or train about this, that's racial equity partner information. I'll leave that up for a second. And this is the information for the National Coalition. 2 things that we're doing really quickly. I'm going to stop, but a couple of things I want to share with you. We have come to inflection points so many times in history. We have this momentum, we start to make movement, and then we go back to business as usual. Let's not go back to business as usual. We can end homelessness in this country. We can change the direction of racial equity in this country. All we have to do is be committed to do it. And if you think people that have lived experience are not valuable, and you don't know, sometimes you're doing this work and it's hard and you get sometimes frustrated because you see the same people showing up. People do change. 4 things I want to leave you with. People do not want to be homeless. People are forced into homelessness. We can end homelessness. And if you haven't seen the tangible results of our policies and programs working, today you do. I'm the tangible results of people helping to end homelessness, people being behind people. You were behind me when I won my Emmy. You were behind me when I talked at the United Nations. You were behind me when I talked to 5 presidents. So nothing is impossible. I want to leave you with a quote from Booker T. Washington. What he says is that success should not be judged by one's stations in life, but the obstacles they had to overcome to get there. And finally, I want you to join our campaign. We have a campaign that I think can move to end homelessness in the country. It's called the Bring America Home Now campaign. You can sign up using the website at the bottom. We need everybody in this room. And I'm going to stop now because I only have 3 minutes. And if anybody has questions, I would love to hear your questions. Yes. Liz has the slides and she'll share them with you. And if anybody wants any additional information about the work of racial equity or the work of homelessness, my individual email is there. Please contact me if you'd like to hear any more about this work, about the work we're doing at the federal level. We have an ambitious goal of ending homelessness, and we hope you'll join us in that. If you truly believe that we can, please join us. So we're working on a production bill that would move away from some of those practices. I think the first thing we have to do, and we're working on this also, is McKinney-Vento. So you know that under the eligibility guidelines, if you've been in an institution for more than 90 days, you're not eligible for services. And if you go to jail and come back and you are chronically homeless before you go to jail, you have to do some more time as chronically homeless. You're ineligible right then. It makes absolutely no sense. So we were founded on the work of criminalization. We've published reports over the last 20 years that look at the issue of criminalization. We're working really hard on something called the Cicero Institute. Look it up. It's a group that's actively presenting model legislations to states around the country. So Georgia, Arizona, Missouri, Tennessee have all created criminalization practices. So not only are we not doing enough for people leaving the criminal justice situation, we're creating more people in the criminal justice system. And so we're working very hard. I met with the Secretary of DOJ. They are, for the first time, examining communities around criminalization practice. They're in Phoenix right now. They're going to other cities, hopefully. They have been a little busy with other issues right now. So they aren't moving as fast as we should, but we really have done all of our work around criminalization. We do that every day. We're having a hard time though. It's a heavy fight. We looked at 168 cities, 68 have these no sleeping, no camping, no lying. The worst of all is, and I don't know how people feel about this, but I will say one thing that really gets under my skin is sex offenders. So you become a sex offender in several communities in this country if you are urinating outside. So you are labeled a sex offender for life for urinating outside. And we don't want people urinating outside, but if you don't have bathrooms, this is a biological issue. You can't get away from that. You can't not get rid of your waste. And so people are being labeled as sex offenders. And you know what that does to housing and jobs. So we got to handle that issue. I could do a whole webinar on criminalization, and I have. And the one thing that, and I'll say this and shut up, the one thing that's really encouraging about this is that I did a webinar with the National Alliance to End Homelessness and the National Low Income Housing Coalition on criminalization. 4,000 people were on that webinar. That's the most I've ever seen on a webinar. So people are really concerned about this. And in the Ninth Circuit, Martin versus Voisey, there was legislation passed the Supreme Court that makes it illegal to do this unless you have enough shelter. And guess what? No community has enough shelter, but people are just ignoring it. So thank you very much. You have a nice day.